The poet. The poet was born, like so many poets, in a small Midwestern town. He was raised in a sprawling Victorian farmhouse whose grounds were no longer being used as a working farm. The only remnant of the property's agrarian past was a goat, which the rest of his family ignored, but to which the poet grew deeply attached, and which would later appear in many of his poems. A grainy photograph of the house itself, taken sometime around the turn of the century, would grace the cover of his second, most successful collection, a photograph he had originally found in the attic on a hunt for hidden Christmas presents. As soon as he could, the poet moved to the far west, taking with him nothing more than a few books and a few dollars. He won a scholarship to a prestigious but affordable public university in a sprawling western city, soaking up the words of the old poets in the warm Pacific sun. He fell in with the students of the new atonal music, which was just beginning to gain notoriety in the art world, if not in the world of classical music itself. He enjoyed their combination of strict discipline and charming recklessness, so akin to his own. He sat quietly writing reams of poorly formed poems in the corners of their studios, their recordings library, and the hall that would later be renamed for the composer who was their idol and the leader of their movement. He skipped classes to attend their workshops, where they would present versions of his poems set to moody and uncertain music. After graduation, the poet installed himself in a residential hotel in one of the city's cheap, unfashionable neighborhoods. He took odd jobs offered to him by a few of his composer friends, those who had rejected the avant-garde for the more reliable income of film scoring. He met and loved a series of wild, long-haired women who did not fully realize that they were becoming the subjects of poems. As he worked, he improved in spite of his lifestyle and habits. He won an important prize that included the publication of his first book. He got an agent. He got reviewed. He began to be known. In his ambitious 30s, he moved his current long-haired woman and their young daughter into squat land in the middle of the southwestern desert. He built their house, dug their rudimentary plumbing, lit fires to ward off beasts. He restored to working order an old camp stove they'd found on the side of the road. He carved his own set of checkers from mesquite wood, preferring to leave the game of chess to the abstract painters he admired only a little less than his former companions, the atonal composers. He built a playhouse for his daughter that was scarcely less functional than their real house. His woman, he had begun to think of her as his wife, made bowls and plates from native clay and set them out to dry in the sun. She wept when he wasn't looking. Once a year, the three of them drove in their rattle-trap truck all the way to New York, so the poet could give readings at cafes and cooperative bookstores. The woman chopped off all her hair just before giving birth to a son. She screamed so loud the beasts stayed away without fires. In a year she was gone, taking their children with her. By the time his 40s arrived, the poet's career was stagnant and he was alone in the middle of the desert. He gave up his agent, who had long since given up on him without his knowing it, and began to be published by a tiny operation in the Pacific Northwest. They printed their books on recycled paper at a time when most people still hadn't heard of recycling. Before long, the poet followed his manuscripts to the land of pine trees and perpetual rain. In the Pacific Northwest, he met a reliable woman who taught grade school and lived in a restored cottage around which she maintained a thriving garden. She had shorter hair than he was used to, but she was a wonderful cook and had already read most of his poems. He was intelligent enough to make himself appear sensible, and besides, she liked his wildness. With her, he had a little daughter who was cleaner and better dressed than either of his previous children had ever been. His publisher matured into a well-respected small press, and the poet's reputation grew or was reestablished with it. Libraries and private collectors began to acquire his early publications and obscure editions. He was included in anthologies. He was invited to speak, rather than simply showing up in his ancient jalopy. A new flowering of creativity overtook him as he gained the perspective required to write about the past, what he was so hesitantly starting to call his youth. The rational woman began to fall away as he took on larger and more ambitious projects, editing work, even a little translation. He had known French once, until one day she was gone entirely. He moved into a small studio apartment and no longer noticed his loneliness. The poet became laureate when he was too old to care, though not too old to lecture. He traveled to universities all over the country, including the one at which his younger daughter had matriculated. She attended his talk and listened to him read his poems, but did not approach him afterwards. She had thought at first that she was a character in one of the poems he was reading, but it turned out to be his other daughter, the one who had lived with him in the desert. By the time he was finished signing highlighted course readers and used copies of book-length poems, she was already having a beer with friends in student housing. After years of lectures and a few visiting professorships, the poet grew tired. He had refused all offers of permanent appointment, even from prominent institutions, preferring instead to wander like the poets of old. He was even beginning to feel like the poets of old. His neck hurt, and his writing grew poorer and poorer by the year. He longed to settle in a warm climate, no more than a block from a decent cafe and maybe an independent bookstore. He bought a cheap condo 1 state away from his former desert compound, just half an hour's drive from the fancy suburb where his elder daughter lived with her husband and 2 children. He had not seen his son, her brother, in many years, though the poet understood that he visited her regularly. The condo was the only home he'd ever owned, but he would live there for less time than anywhere else in his adult life. The poet died as he was born, in the style of poets. No, not by his own hand, though in his late 40s he considered a bridge not far from his Middle Western birthplace. He died at home in bed, finally seriously ill from 7 decades of careless living. He'd never been sick a day in his life, aside from drink and a few seasonal colds. He died surrounded by loving, though illegitimate children, who took care to be sure that their father did not spend his last days in filth and obscurity. Or were they illegitimate? The dying poet could not remember whether he'd properly married their respective mothers or if they'd only had common law arrangements. He wanted to remember these women in that moment, but they had been gone too long now, and he couldn't picture them. Were they even still alive? He tried to ask his children. All 3 were there, so he must have reconciled with his only son, but no words came out. He remembered that one woman had been long-haired and one shorter, but both immeasurably kind. Better still, he remembered the farmhouse where he had grown up, which he would have liked to reclaim and convert back into a working farm, but he had been too busy then when his parents died and it was sold. He remembered the goat who gave no milk and who had had a beard despite being female because of her breed. He could remember being so alone, so wholly alone as a child, as alone as any child could ever be, and at those moments, the she-goat being there, a warm presence smelling of alfalfa and spit and shit and life. And in the light of that memory, the poet died.